The first thing I heard at the Mendoza place wasn't a greeting. It was a gate banging against a post, and a woman's voice cutting through the wind, sharp with panic instead of welcome. I had a manila folder under my arm with a dollar figure that could end this farm, and before I'd said a single word of why I'd driven 2 hours out from the Highline offices, a black heifer barreled past my truck and straight for the open county road. I dropped the folder on the seat and went after it. She was already running, skirts snagging on the fence wire, shouting a name that wasn't the cow's. "Tomas, get the other gate!" And for 10 strange seconds, the woman who owed my bank $41,000 and I were just two people trying to keep an animal from getting killed on Route 9. I cut wide, clapped my hands low and steady the way my grandfather taught me, before either of us had a mortgage to our name, and turned the heifer back toward the open pasture gate. She slid it shut behind it with a clang that seemed to settle the whole morning. That was when she finally looked at me. Not at my truck, not at the Highline Agricultural Trust decal on the door. At me, breathing hard, a stranger who'd just helped without being asked. "You're not from around here," she said. "No, ma'am." I held up the folder I'd retrieved, suddenly feeling its weight differently than I had 10 minutes ago. "I'm afraid I'm not here for anything you'll thank me for, either." She didn't ask what I meant yet. She turned to the boy jogging up from the second gate. 13, all elbows, sweat at his hairline, and told him to check the fence line for the gap the heifer found. Then she walked to the old wooden post by the drive, leaned against it, and started refastening the buttons of a cream cardigan that had come loose somewhere in the chase, her blue cotton dress catching the morning light, the red barn and the hay bales behind her, like something out of a calendar nobody had taken down in years. "Say it then," she said. I said it. Highline held the note her late husband signed 3 years ago against the equipment line and the South 40. Payments had lapsed 5 months running. I was here to assess the property for the file before the bank decided whether to extend, restructure, or foreclose. I used the word foreclose because softening it would have been its own kind of lie. And I had learned a long time ago that people forgive hard facts faster than they forgive being managed. Her jaw didn't move, but her hands stopped on the buttons. "My husband's been dead 14 months, Mr. White. Dean White. Mr. White. And you drove 2 hours to tell me what a stack of letters already told me." Something brittle cracked through the calm. "I know what I owe." I didn't argue. I had learned that too, that a person who already knows the number doesn't need it repeated. They need to know what happens next. "I'm not here to take anything today," I said. "I'm here to write down what's true. What's true changes what I can fight for upstairs." She studied me the way you'd study a man who says he's different from the last 3 men who promised the same thing. Then Thomas hollered from the fence line that he'd found the gap, and the moment ended without her ever quite deciding to trust me. That night, back at the motel off the highway, I called my supervisor, Marcus Holt, and told him the equipment was sound, the cattle were healthy, and the only thing failing on that farm was the cash flow of a woman trying to run 40 head alone. Holt didn't care about any of it. "Region's behind quota, Dean. Mendoza's the easiest file on your desk. Recommend foreclosure by Friday, and let legal handle the rest." I told him I needed 2 more weeks to finish the assessment properly. He gave me one, and the way he said it made it clear he was already writing my name on a different kind of file. The kind that decided who got promoted and who got replaced. I drove back out the next morning anyway. She didn't want me there, and she said so twice before she let me past the porch steps. But the ledger she finally slid across her kitchen table told a story the Highline file hadn't bothered to ask about. Payments that had gone out on time for 2 years, then a sudden jump in the interest rate 8 months before her husband died. Buried in a refinance clause neither of them had understood when they signed it. I read contracts the way other men read box scores. Something about the clause didn't sit right, and I told her so before I'd fully admitted it to myself. "You think it's a mistake?" she said. "I think it's worth checking," I said, and didn't let myself say more because hope is a dangerous thing to hand a woman who has had it taken from her once already. Over the next 10 days, I came back more than the file required. And each time I told myself it was the clause, the rate, the math that didn't square. And each time some part of the visit had nothing to do with numbers at all. I noticed she rubbed the back of her neck when Thomas's school called about the bus fee she couldn't quite make. I noticed she fed me before she fed herself, and pretended it was an accident of timing. I noticed she laughed once, short and surprised, when I told her the heifer reminded me of every quarterly auditor I'd ever met, and then she looked almost embarrassed to have laughed at all. I kept my hands busy with paperwork instead of anything else. When the porch step gave a soft, dangerous creak under my boot, I came back the following Saturday with lumber and fixed it before she'd noticed it was broken twice. When I saw her wince, stretching for the high shelf where she kept the bank letters, I built her a stool from scrap and left it by the pantry door without a word. She found it there and didn't ask who'd made it, because by then, she already knew. Grace, her sister, met me on my 4th visit with the particular suspicion of a woman who has watched men in suits before. "You're the bank," she said, like an accusation. "I'm trying not to be today," I said, and Grace's eyes narrowed, like she was deciding whether that was a confession or a line. It was the truth, though it cost me. Holt called twice that week to ask why my recommendation wasn't filed. I told him I was verifying a clause discrepancy. He told me discrepancies were for lawyers, not accountants who wanted to keep their bonus. He drove out himself the following week, which should have told me how nervous my questions had made him. Marcus Holt didn't get out of his sedan so much as deploy from it, suit pressed despite the dust, and he shook Liliana's hand with the particular warmth of a man who has read a script titled Compassionate Banking and never once believed a line of it. "Mrs. Mendoza, I understand the stress of this process," he said, glancing once at the cattle, twice at his watch. "Highline wants to work with you, but the numbers are the numbers." "The numbers changed 8 months before my husband died," she said, flat and certain. "Mr. White can tell you exactly how." Holt's smile didn't move, but something behind it did. "Dean's thorough, sometimes too thorough for his own paycheck." He said it lightly, like a joke between colleagues, and only I understood it as the warning it was. When he left, he didn't look at the farm again. He looked at me, the whole drive back to his car, the way a man looks at a tool he's deciding whether to keep using or replace. Tomas, for his part, decided I was tolerable roughly the same week the heifer started following me around the pasture like I owed her money too. He was 13 and careful with his trust, the way kids get when they've already lost one grown man they counted on, and he tested me with questions that weren't really about cattle at all. Whether I was staying, whether the bank could really take the house, whether his mother knew how worried he was, even when she pretended she didn't notice. I answered the ones I could answer honestly, and told him the truth about the ones I couldn't. He seemed to respect that more than he would have respected false comfort. I should have backed off there. Instead, I drove to the county recorder's office on my own time and pulled every refinance document Highline had filed in the district for the past 3 years. The pattern wasn't subtle, once I knew where to look. 11 small farms, all refinanced through the same satellite office, all carrying an undisclosed rate escalator buried in Clause 14, all flagged for foreclosure within 18 months of signing. Liliana Mendoza wasn't behind because she couldn't run a farm. She was behind because somebody at Highline had built a machine designed to make sure she would be. I sat with that printout longer than I want to admit, because proving it meant naming my own employer as the architect of it, and naming it meant the end of any career I had left at Highline. I told her on a Tuesday, at her kitchen table, with the late light turning the windows gold, and Tomas doing homework 2 rooms away. I laid the documents out, one by one, the way I'd lay out evidence for anyone, except my hands weren't as steady as they usually were when I did this. They didn't just lend Marco money, I said. They built a trap and waited for it to close. On him, on 10 other families. She didn't cry, though I half expected her to. She went very still, the way people do when grief finds a new edge to cut on. 14 months, she said quietly. And I thought it was just bad luck. It wasn't luck. It was a clause nobody read out loud to him. I pushed the documents an inch closer. I can prove it. But proving it means filing against my own bank, and Holt will fire me before the ink dries. She looked at the papers, then at me. Why would you do that? Because the last time I let a number decide what was fair instead of what was true, I told myself it wasn't my call to make. The words came out plainer than I meant them to, and for once, I let them. I'm done doing that. She reached across the table, not for my hand, not yet, just for the edge of the folder. And for a second, our fingers were close enough that I felt the old, useless urge to close the distance. I didn't. I slid the folder fully toward her instead, because she deserved to hold the proof in her own hands before she held anything of mine. The weeks in between weren't all courthouses and contracts. Some Saturdays I came out with nothing official to do at all, and we filled them with the kind of small, unremarkable tasks that somehow mattered more than they should have. I taught Thomas how to read a balance sheet using the farm's own feed receipts, more to give him something steady to hold on to than because a 13-year-old needed accounting skills. And he took to it with the fierce, quiet pride of a kid who'd been told too many times that he was too young to understand the trouble his family was in. Liliana made coffee that was too strong on purpose, she admitted once, because her husband had always complained it wasn't strong enough, and she'd never had the heart to change the habit. I drank it anyway, every time, without comment, and she noticed that I noticed. One evening, with rain coming in sideways across the pasture and the power flickering twice before holding, she handed me a towel for my soaked sleeves and didn't say anything about how late I'd stayed. We sat at the kitchen table with the lamp turned low, Thomas already asleep down the hall, and talked about nothing that mattered to the bank at all. Her husband's terrible jokes, my father's hardware store before it closed, the particular stubbornness required to keep 40 head of cattle alive through a Midwestern winter. I caught myself wanting to reach for her hand more than once. Each time, I picked up my coffee cup instead, because some part of me still believed that wanting something for myself in the middle of trying to save her home would make the saving feel less honest. She noticed that too, though she never said so directly. Just let her hand rest a little closer to mine on the table than the conversation strictly required, and let me decide what to do with the distance. The second obstacle came not from Highline, but from inside the house. A week before the hearing, Liliana told me, carefully and without much warning, that she thought I should stop coming out so often. People in town are talking, she said, arms crossed against the porch rail, not quite looking at me.
The bank's accountant, out here 3 nights a week. It doesn't look like an audit anymore, Dean.
It isn't one, I said. Hasn't been for a while.
That's the problem.
Her voice cracked just slightly on the word.
If this goes wrong, if Holt finds a way to bury the regulator's findings, if the hearing doesn't go our way, I need people to believe I fought for this farm because I earned it, not because I let the man trying to take it fall for me instead.
I understood the fear under it better than she probably wanted me to. She wasn't pushing me away because she didn't want me there. She was protecting the one thing Highline hadn't managed to take from her yet. Her own credit, in her town, on her own terms. I told her I'd give her the space she was asking for, and I meant it, even though it left an emptier kind of quiet in my motel room than I expected. I kept working the case from a distance instead. Calls to the state regulator, 2 more trips to the recorder's office, a long, careful conversation with Grace's clerk friend about exactly how the 11 contracts could be pulled without anyone losing their job over it. I didn't call Liliana once that week. Not because I'd stopped caring, but because for once in my life I wanted to prove something through what I did, not through what I said. The midpoint arrived on a Thursday, with a county courier and a certified envelope. Highline was accelerating the foreclosure timeline, citing documented delinquency, with a hearing date set for 3 weeks out. Clause 14's escalator triggered automatically the moment Liliana's account crossed 90 days past due, a fact buried so deep in the contract's fine print that not even her own lawyer had caught it on first read. Holt had moved faster than I'd planned for, because somehow he'd learned I'd been asking the recorder's office questions he didn't want answered. She called me that night, voice tight in a way I hadn't heard from her before.
They're moving up the date, Dean. 3 weeks.
Then we have 3 weeks, I said, though my own chest had gone cold, reading the same notice an hour earlier. Sit with me a minute. Not about the farm. She was quiet for a long moment, and then, in a smaller voice than I'd ever heard her use, she told me about the night Marco died. Hart, not the farm, though everyone in town assumed otherwise, and how she'd spent the year since convinced that failing to save the farm would mean failing him twice. I told her about my own father's hardware store, sold out from under him by a bank that called it restructuring, and how I'd built a career making sure I'd never again stand on the side of the desk that did the calling. We didn't touch, not then. I just stayed on the line until her breathing evened out. And when she finally said goodnight, something in my chest had quietly rearranged itself into a shape I didn't have a polite name for yet. Holt found out about the recorder's office 2 days later. He called me into a conference room with a closed door, and a tone I recognized from every story about men who'd crossed him before me. You've been building a case against your own employer on company time, Dean. I can end this with one phone call to compliance, or you can file the Mendoza foreclosure today and we forget this conversation happened. The 11 other families won't forget it, I said. Neither will the state regulator, once I send them Clause 14. You'd torch your own career over a farm widow you've known a month. I'd torch it over the truth, I said, and felt something settle in me as I said it. Not triumph, just the quiet, unglamorous relief of finally choosing the harder, honest answer instead of the easy, comfortable one. Fire me if you want. The documents go to the state either way. He didn't fire me that day. He suspended me instead, pending review, which was its own kind of answer. I drove straight to the farm without calling ahead, something I hadn't let myself do before, and found her on the porch with Tomas's homework spread across her lap and worry written plainly on her face. I told her everything. The suspension, the regulator, the 11 families, The fact that I had no idea anymore whether I'd still have a job by the hearing date. She listened without interrupting, the way she listened to everything. And when I finished, she didn't reach for reassurance. She reached for a plan.
"Grace knows the county clerk," she said. "If we can get the other 10 families' contracts pulled before the hearing, it isn't just my word against Highlines. It's 11.
It took 9 days, 2 trips to the state banking division, and one terrifying afternoon when Grace's clerk friend almost lost her own job pulling files she technically wasn't authorized to release. But by the morning of the hearing, I had 11 contracts, 1 regulator's preliminary finding of predatory rate escalation, and a packet thick enough that the foreclosure judge actually paused before letting Highline's lawyer speak. I stood up in that courtroom, not as Highline's forensic accountant anymore, but as a private witness, with documents the bank itself hadn't disclosed. I laid out Clause 14, line by line, the pattern across 11 farms, the dates, the math nobody upstairs had wanted checked. Holt sat 2 rows back, jaw tight, saying nothing, because there was nothing left to say that the documents hadn't already said for him. The judge didn't issue a ruling that closed the case outright. That would take weeks. But she stayed the foreclosure pending a full regulatory review and ordered Highline to suspend collection on all 11 flagged accounts immediately. Liliana's farm wasn't saved by a miracle. It was saved because somebody had finally done the unglamorous, exhausting work of proving the truth on paper, in a room full of witnesses, where it couldn't quietly disappear. Outside the courthouse, in the cold, bright light of a county morning, Liliana found me before I found her. Grace stood a respectful few steps back with Tomas, both of them grinning like the morning had finally given them something to grin about. Grace caught my arm before I could say anything else.
"The clerk's getting a commendation out of this, not a pink slip," she said, low enough that only I could hear.
Turns out the regulator likes whistleblowers more than Highline expected. Thought you'd want to know you didn't cost her anything. It was a small relief, but a real one, and I let myself feel it. Marcus Holt's name came up exactly once more, in a phone call from a former colleague a month later, mentioning that the regional office had quietly let him go ahead of the state's findings going public. Not fired with fanfare, just removed, the way men like that usually are, with no one in the building particularly sorry to see him go. I didn't celebrate it. I just felt the small, clean relief of watching a system finally catch up to a man who had spent years staying just ahead of consequences.
"You lost your job for this," Liliana said.
I'd lose it again. I meant it more plainly than any speech I could have built around it. She didn't ask permission, and I didn't reach first. She closed the distance herself, her hand finding mine in front of the courthouse steps, in front of her son, her sister, and anyone in town who cared to look. A small, deliberate, public thing, exactly the size of a choice she'd made on her own terms.
"Then come finish that porch railing you keep promising to get to," she said, "as more than the bank's accountant."
I laughed. Actually laughed. Something I hadn't done easily in longer than I wanted to admit, and said I'd need a key if I was going to keep showing up uninvited at 6 in the morning. She didn't hand me a key that day. She told Tomas to cut one at the hardware store that weekend, which amounted to the same promise, without the speech. 3 weeks later, with Highline's regional office under formal review, and my old job replaced by a contract auditing role for the state banking division, work that paid less and let me sleep better than anything Holt had ever offered me. I drove out to the farm on a Sunday that had nothing urgent attached to it at all. Liliana met me at the new gate, the one Thomas and I had hung together the week before, and for once neither of us had a folder or a deadline between us.
"I keep thinking about that first morning," she said,
watching the cattle move slow and easy across the pasture.
You chasing my heifer down the road before you'd even told me your name.
In my defense, the heifer didn't give me much choice.
No,
she said, and there was warmth in it now, instead of the wariness from that first day.
I don't suppose she did.
I reached for her hand the way I'd been quietly disciplining myself not to for 2 months. And this time, there was no reason left to stop myself. She let me, and when I finally kissed her, soft, unhurried, more a promise kept than a question asked, it felt less like an ending to anything, and more like the first signed page of something we both intended to finish properly, together, on terms neither bank nor circumstance had written for us. Looking back now, I understand something I couldn't have explained to Holt in that conference room, even if he'd wanted to hear it. Winning the wrong way is just losing slower. The only kind of victory worth keeping is the kind you can still look at honestly in the morning. The kind that lets you sleep with a clear conscience instead of a fatter file. I didn't save that farm by being clever. I saved it by refusing to be quiet, and somewhere in the middle of doing the right thing, the slow, unglamorous way, I found a life I actually wanted to wake up for. The end. Closing thoughts. If there's one thing I hope you take from Dean and Liliana's story, it's this. Real love isn't drama. It's integrity. Choosing the honest, hard road, even when the easy, wrong one would be so much faster. That's what actually lasts. If you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe so we can share more stories like this.